Putin has been able to use this phraseology that he's involved in a special military operation, fighting against terrorists, pushing back against the West's effort to undermine Russia. But it's always been that he's been able to control the scale and scope of this conflict, and therefore has not needed to use conscripts, and in particular, not been drawing on conscripts who might have come from places like Moscow, Leningrad, some of the more affluent and politically influential parts of Russia. The fact is now some of these people precisely have been captured, and there are some very explicit messages being put online by mothers and others, saying we're loyal to you, our president, Vladimir Putin, but you need to get our boys back.
Joining me now is Robin Niblett, who is author, distinguished fellow at Chatham House and the Institute's former director. Hello, Robin.
Hello, Carol.
Thanks so much for joining us. Let me ask you, first of all, about what we were hearing from Sergei Petukov, that the Russians have already opened negotiations on trying to get some of their prisoners of war back.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not surprising, not least as you've probably been hearing, many of these prisoners are conscripts, and there's a particular raw nerve about conscripts being captured, not least because they're not meant to be deployed into areas of active military operations unless they've had at least 4 months and fighting experience or training experience, sorry, and also have signed up to become sort of contract soldiers. And if you think back to the era of the Afghan war and so on, it was the use of conscripts over time that gradually undermined political support and popular support at home for the Afghan operation. So I think, Putin has been able to use this phraseology that he's involved in a special military operation, fighting against terrorists, pushing back against the West's effort to undermine Russia. But it's always been that he's been able to control the scale and scope of this conflict, and therefore has not needed to use conscripts, and in particular, not been drawing on conscripts who might have come from places like Moscow, Leningrad, some of the more affluent and politically influential parts of Russia. The fact is now some of these people precisely have been captured, and there are some very explicit messages being put online by mothers and others, saying we're loyal to you, our president, Vladimir Putin, but you need to get our boys back. So it doesn't surprise me they've entered these negotiations.
Yeah, I mean, it is a huge embarrassment, isn't it, to President Putin, this incursion into his territory. Ukrainian forces claiming to have captured around 450 square miles of Russian territory. We can't independently verify that. But what you do see openly is Ukrainian correspondents reporting from Russian soil, reporting the dismay of some of the local Russian citizens. And as we're hearing there, some of those Russian conscripts saying, well, they weren't prepared to go to the front line and are now in Ukrainian prisons.
Look, it is an embarrassment. I think it's more of an embarrassment to obviously Vladimir Putin internationally. It's a humiliation, in fact, not just an embarrassment to have Russian territory actually seized this way and potentially occupied for a lengthy period of time. So nothing of this sort has happened since the 1940s, early 1940s. But this attack has happened at a very particular moment. Vladimir Putin has just won his next term as president. He's at the beginning of his next 6-year term. He's just completed a sort of reorganization of the leadership of the Russian Ministry of Defense, making sure he's got some new people in there, people who are loyal to him. He's also made a number of changes in other domestic political positions, bringing in even some of the next generation of those who've been most loyal to him over the past 20, 25 years. My sense this is not as the situation was last summer. Remember when we had the Wagner mutiny, that was the last summer surprise, if you want to call it. But it strikes me that Putin, at the moment at least, is in a relatively strong position. That might be a hostage to fortune kind of comment I've just made, but I'm going to make it nonetheless, in a relatively strong position. And he is utterly focused on his number one objective, which is to seize as much of Donetsk and Luhansk, the Donbass region, which is central to his vision of a potentially acceptable ceasefire or even peace agreement at the end of this conflict. And as long as he can make sure they don't lose more and there aren't too many conscripts kept as POWs, he can then turn his attention to the part of Kursk that has been taken by the Ukrainians, which he's pretty certain the Ukrainians are never going to want to keep, and that we, as his backers in America and Europe, are not going to let him keep. So I think his view is staunch the attacks, take the blow, but the bigger gain for him, and we're seeing it in the fact that he's not moving significant troops out of the Donbass region, is to complete what is currently, and by the way, even in the last week, some very impressive advances, or at least important advances, in the area beyond Donetsk city in eastern Ukraine.
A lot to unpick. We've been hearing from the Ukrainians that it's not their intention to hold this chunk of Russian territory, Kursk and beyond, for the long term. What do you think the intention, the objective is?
Well, I think there are four objectives. We've covered one of them, which is literally to capture POWs to trade back for other POWs. But I think there are three main reasons. Number one, to regain the initiative militarily. Basically, Ukrainian forces have been gradually, painfully losing territory in eastern Ukraine for the past 3 to 4 months, ever since the breakthrough around Advitka took place. And so it is a relentlessly negative picture, despite the arrival of new military equipment. They simply don't have the forces and the troops and the quantities of equipment and the kind of hinterland that Russia has to be able to really hold back Russia so long as Vladimir Putin is willing to lose large numbers of troops in capturing that territory. So
And we are already seeing British tanks being used as part of that offensive onto Russian territory. Do you think that there are risks in that?
I don't think there are risks of escalation of any sort. As you may know, they've created outside Moscow a kind of museum where you can come and look at captured NATO equipment, including some, I think, an A1 Abrams American tank as well. They know this is going on. I don't think this particular changes the context. But what it does mean for Zelensky, however, President Zelensky, he needs, number one, to regain the initiative militarily, try to draw some of those forces away. He doesn't seem to be succeeding on that front so far. Importantly, he needs to regain the initiative at home. Politically, Zelensky is losing popularity. The conflict is not going well, and that undermines him. This gives him a new fillip and a new kind of injection. And then finally, as we've discussed already, it is about trying to get to in a position where when negotiations start, and most people believe something like that could start at some point after the US presidential election, maybe later this year, most probably in the spring of the following year, an opportunity for them to negotiate not from a position of weakness, but from a position of greater strength, should we say.
Robin Niblett, a distinguished fellow at Chatham House, the Institute's former director, also, of course, an author and expert on the region. Really good to have your analysis. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks, Carol.